Elyse?
Yes, I'll do so, Carl.
Thank you.
You ready? Yes, thank you. I'm happy to introduce Ms. Elyse Max, who holds an MA degree in sociology from the University of Missouri in Kansas City. Ms. Max joined Missourians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, commonly known as MADP, in 2018, after leaving a decade-long career in higher education, where her work focused on education of those most marginalized in society, and those include refugees, immigrants, and people incarcerated. And also individuals impacted by the criminal justice system. Elyse became state executive director for MADP in October of 2019. And as director, she works to amplify those most impacted by the death penalty and those whose voices are central to the work around the death penalty. Elyse believes that ending the death penalty will promote nonviolence in local communities, and that murder is never an appropriate state response to crime. Some of you know that I serve on the board of directors for MADP, and that provides me with an opportunity to work frequently with Elyse Max. And I could say that as a board member, I'm very appreciative of her talents and skills. And it's a pleasure to work with someone who brings as much energy and skill to this work as does Miss Elyse Max. So happy to present to you Elyse Max.
Thank you so very much, Wiley. I appreciate all of your work against the death penalty in Missouri, and thank you all for inviting me here today. If you just hold on 1 second, I'm going to try to get a screen share going. There we go. All right. Okay, so my name is Elyse Max. I am the director of Missourians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. I intend to give you a little bit of background about the death penalty in Missouri in general today. And then I want to talk more specifically about a clemency campaign that is happening now for Ernest Johnson. And he is a man from Boone County specifically. So we'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers. And I know that I'll need to wrap that up around 1 o'clock, I believe, to make sure we have time for that. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. A little bit of background about the death penalty. MADP, Missourians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, we are the only statewide organization who is focused strictly on abolition of the death penalty. We really view the death penalty as the tip of the iceberg in a system that is full of injustice. So we see the connection between past historical racial injustice and how that plays out in the mass incarceration system today. So the death penalty is basically allowing the state to commit murder in the name of public safety. And once we kind of start peeling back the onion that is the death penalty, it reveals so many of the underlying problems in the application of quote unquote justice throughout the nation, and specifically the issues that are apparent in Missouri. A little bit of background, the death penalty was commonly used in Missouri throughout the 1800s. We rely on research by a professor, well, she's retired, a retired professor, Harriet Frazier, who has a book about lynchings in Missouri and executions in Missouri. She's documented about 285 executions before 1965 in Missouri, mainly through extrajudicial means, lynchings, and whatnot. In 1972, there was a national abolition of the death penalty based on a case in Georgia, Furman versus Georgia. Basically stated that the death penalty is arbitrarily applied Every state has different reasons they apply the death penalty. In some states, it's only for murder. Some states would allow it for kidnapping and rape. And it was being arbitrarily applied based on race. They saw that 85% of people sentenced to death in the South were African Americans. So the Supreme Court put an end to it. And in 1976, states began approaching the Supreme Court one by one with ways they were going to fix the death penalty problem so that they would be able to keep using it in their state. And in 1976, the death penalty was reinstated in Missouri, and we began executing again in 1989. Since 1989, we call that the modern era of executions, that we've executed 90 people in Missouri since 1989. The last execution was in 2020 when Missouri executed Walter Barton. He's a man who was very likely innocent. He had an innocence claim that was not heard before the Missouri Supreme Court. And since I've started at MADP in 2018, we've had one execution a year. It kind of varies, it changes. In 2015, when the director before me started, they were having one execution a month. Currently, there are 20 people sentenced to death in Missouri, and 3 of those people actually were from Boone County, sentenced from Boone County, including Ernest Johnson, who is scheduled for execution on October 5th. So while we do have these executions scheduled, we have nationally more of a small size death row. We do have good news, and the good news is that we believe the citizens of Missouri are opposed to the death penalty. No jury in Missouri has imposed a death sentence since 2013, but we are one of 2 states that allow for a judge to override a deadlocked jury and impose death. So in 2018, in Greene County, a judge overrode a deadlocked jury to impose a death sentence for Craig Woods. That's the last person to enter Missouri's death row. So no new sentences since January of 2018, and anything since 2013 has been judge imposed and not jury imposed. So knowing that juries are the consciousness of the community, we believe that the people of Missouri view life without parole and other punishments as sufficient punishments for first-degree murder, and that we have won over really the hearts and consciousness of Missourians. It is, and the death penalty is used really as a political piece. We see this nationally, and we see this happening in Missouri as well. There are 4 exonerees in Missouri, 4 people that have left death row that have been proven innocent. Nationally, we know that for every 8 people that are executed, 1 person is exonerated. So if we think about the 90 executions in Missouri, we have certainly executed innocent people in our state. That is pretty common. Right now, there are 2 people out of appeals in Missouri. Those are Marcellus Williams. He had a stay of execution in 2018, where the then Governor Greitens allowed for a board of inquiry to meet to review new DNA evidence in his case. He is still sitting on death row. We don't know if the board of inquiry has made a recommendation to the governor or not, but Barry Scheck from the New York Innocence Project, he worked on O.J. Simpson's case. He's the pioneer for DNA evidence in death penalty cases, came to Missouri to present that evidence. So we believe it is pretty cut and dry that Marcellus Williams should no longer be on death row for the murder of Felicia Gale in St. Louis County. Ernest Lee Johnson is also exhausted his appeals. Right now, there is a habeas petition that the attorneys yesterday filed for a rehearing on, based on some new definitions of intellectual disability. And I'll get into that in just a minute. So I don't want to get hung up on that piece right now. Because we're not seeing new cases, 75% of the people on Missouri's row are at the end of their appeals process. So when I work very closely with the legal teams at the Capitol Habeas Unit, who represent the people at the end of the appeals process, and the way that the United States Supreme Court is set up right now, as well as the Missouri Supreme Court, they said we could get up to 5 new dates next year alone, because of the way these appeals have been moving, and our faith and hope in the United States Supreme Court is pretty thin right now as far as death penalty cases go. So we're in dire straits here in Missouri with these 20 folks that are left with death sentences. What do we know about the population of death row? We certainly know that it depends on what county you live in, the likelihood you are to get a death sentence. It depends on your race, the race of the defendant, as well as the race of the victim, and who is more likely to be sentenced to death. In Missouri and nationally, death is only a punishment for first-degree murder. So if you are convicted of first-degree murder, and the prosecutor finds that there were aggravating circumstances, and I believe there are 70 of those that they can choose from, then they can go ahead and impose a death sentence. Of the 20 individuals in Missouri, 7 of them are Black, 13 of them are white. And we know that is a discrepancy as to the population in Missouri, where only about 11% is African American. Even more, again, than the victim or than the race of the defendant is the race of the victims. So in Missouri, if the defendant is African American and the victim is a white female, they are 14 times more likely to receive a death sentence. So nationally, we're finding that the race of the victim is of more importance than the race of the defendant. Very uncommon to receive a death sentence for the murder of a Black individual. Even Black female children is very less likely to receive a death sentence than if the victim is a white male. Locality is important in determining who receives a death sentence or not. The power to decide if they will go for life without parole or death lies solely in the hands of the prosecutors. These are elected officials, and so it's very important to pay attention to prosecutors and to prosecutor races when they're running for office. The picture is of Wesley Bell. He is the prosecutor in St. Louis County. He ran on a platform of reform where he was committed from the gate to never imposing a death sentence in St. Louis County. And that is so important to our work because St. Louis County, under the former prosecutor, Bob McCullough, was the highest county for new death sentences in all of Missouri. In fact, every single African American on Missouri's death row, except for one, was sentenced by Bob McCullough. And all of the men from St. Louis, there are none from St. Louis City, they were also all sentenced by Bob McCullough. So this is one prosecutor who will now be responsible for 11 of the people on Missouri's death row. Wesley Bell took office, and one of his first things that he did was refuse to reimpose a death sentence in the retrial of a man named David Barnett. Prosecutors have a lot of power, and now that they're getting some power in sentencing review because of Senate Bill 53 that just passed, they also are earning power to correct their past wrongs and past wrongs of former prosecutors in convictions. So this is a wonderful route that we can take where prosecutors can say this was a wrongful conviction and actually correct some of these wrongs. So we have some new avenues now, and I think that prosecutor races are getting a lot of new attention, and that's a great thing. But I still think that not a lot of people in political parties focus on prosecutor races. They are not nonpartisan races, and so they are things that we can get involved with. MADP as a 501c3, we basically focus on policy. So we'll put out report cards. We can ask how they feel about conviction review, how they feel about the death penalty, but we'll ask all of the candidates across the board. So we don't support one candidate or another. But after they're elected, especially with people like Wesley Bell, who aren't imposing death sentences, we love to work with prosecutors, help them get speaking engagements. They are on the hot spot so often for doing things wrong that when a group like MADP can uplift someone like Wesley Bell, we're very glad to do that. I know your prosecutor is Daniel Knight, and I will say there are no current pending cases in Boone County. I historically don't believe that Daniel Knight has sought the death penalty. I was kind of going through my county-wide work, but the people that are were impacted by former prosecutor Kevin Crane, who is now a judge. So I think Daniel Knight has not committed to not imposing the death sentence. He's more like the prosecutor we have in Kansas City, who I believe listens to victims, works with victims' families, and more murder victims' families do not want to go through 30+ years of appeals to see a resolution for something that has been so traumatic that just happened to their family. So kind of haven't talked personally to Kevin Crane, but I have a feeling that's where he is in Boone County. Other things that MADP does, we do work with legislators. We are trying to abolish the judge override for non-unanimous death sentences. We believe that will, stop the pipeline of new cases. We host events with exonerees. We work with 2 exonerees from Kansas City, Joe Amrine and Reggie Griffin. We'll speak to colleges, high schools, clubs like your own. We also work directly with the 20 people on death row. I think there's only 2 folks that we don't really talk to, providing them with pen pals and spiritual advisors. Spiritual advisors are really important, especially ones that are connected to communities and are outside of the Department of Corrections. Oftentimes they are Christian or Catholic, and there are a lot of Muslims on death row. And so we help them connect with their communities outside. We work in coalitions. We're working in coalition with the Equal Justice Initiative to make that connection between past racial terror and the modern day mass incarceration system. I know Boone County has a community remembrance project who recently did a soil collection for, I believe it was James Scott. So we work with groups like that to make the connection between past and present. And then in just various different coalitions, our newest coalition are called the Faith Leaders and Clergy of Color Coalition, being organized by our racial justice coordinator out of St. Louis, trying to get pastors and faith leaders involved. Truthfully, as you probably are well aware, Missouri is a state that is there's just so much injustice. So a lot of times organizations are focusing on so many different things at once. The death penalty isn't in their purview until it's execution time. And that's not going to be the way that we're going to be able to end the death penalty. So working in coalitions is very important to us in order for people to see the interconnectedness of our work with all other criminal legal reform work that is being done in Missouri, as well as racial justice work and other types of social justice work, mental health work as well. Some of the coalitions that we work with the NAACP quite often. We work with MASME, which is Missouri Alliance for a mental health exemption for folks that have severe mental health issues at the time of the crime. The Supreme Court says they should be exempt from the death penalty, but Missouri's not put anything in place in law to allow for that exemption. We work with the Missouri Catholic Conference. Right now, because of Ernest's case, we're working with a lot of disability organizations to bring attention to issues of folks with intellectual disabilities on death row. Of course, the players like ACLU, I mentioned the NAACP, are all very, very important to our work. Right now, we are working on the clemency campaign for Ernest Johnson and Marcellus Williams, but Ernest Johnson is very urgent. He has an execution date of October 5th. He is a man with an intellectual disability. He should not be eligible for execution. He should have, from the get-go, had a pre-trial exemption that only made him eligible for life without parole. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that case because it is so specific to Columbia. I guess I can't really see everybody, but I don't know how familiar you are. If you were in Columbia in 1994 or 1995, then you certainly probably have heard of Ernest Johnson's case. We did an info session on October 6th, so I'm recycling these slides. So excuse the date that is incorrect on those. But just a little bit about Ernest Johnson's case. Ernest Johnson was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder for the 1994 deaths of Mary Bratcher, Maple Scruggs, and Fred Jones. They were employees of a Casey's convenience store in Columbia, Missouri. And from my understanding is that Missouri was much smaller in 1994, that this was a very horrendous crime. It got a lot of media attention, and it kind of stoked a fear in Columbia that hadn't been there before. And so we recognize the impact of the crime, not only on the murder victims' family members, but as well as on the communities in which these crimes that have happened. Through the 26 years of appeals, Ernest's death sentence has been overturned 2 times based on incorrect presentation of evidence on the ID claim. So there is no question about his culpability in the crime, but the question is whether or not he is eligible for execution based on his intellectual and developmental disability. So twice his death sentence has been overturned. The 3rd time he was sentenced to death, they pulled an all-white jury from Pettis County, and this was in 2012, I'm sorry, and they sentenced him to death. So these sentences have been coming from a jury of lay people instead of from medical experts and people in the field that can look at the evidence around his intellectual disability claim. So basically what happened is in 2002, a case called Atkins versus Virginia was heard in the Supreme Court, and they ruled that executing people with intellectual disabilities is unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional based on the 8th Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. But Atkins versus Virginia left it up to the states to define who has an intellectual disability, what criteria the states would use to determine who has a disability. In Missouri, they rely on the standard diagnosis for IDD that someone has an intellectual disability with an early onset, so that they have IQ tests that show a sub-average intelligence and that there are deficits in adaptive functioning. Ernest, throughout his whole life, has had attention to his ID. He was in special education in a segregated school in Mississippi County in the 1960s. And he's had 9 IQ tests throughout his life that prove that he's had early onset and that he is below average intelligence. And in fact, he also meets the standards for the deficits in adaptive functioning. But what happens is when the prosecutor is presenting this information to a jury of lay people, they are not experts at determining these factors. So in the 3rd trial, the prosecutor asked the jury to rely on their gut, rely on your gut feelings about Ernest Johnson, and that he obviously has street smarts. They relied on stereotypes of people with intellectual disabilities. They relied on testimony from corrections officials and not from his family members or people that he went to school with. Corrections officials said that he could play complicated card games and that he could play basketball, therefore proving that he doesn't have an intellectual disability. These are not the standard and clinical definitions for meeting adaptive deficits. They're supposed to be deficits based on how he's unable to function based on his ID, not the fact that he can play basketball proves that he doesn't have an intellectual disability. So a lot of errors, a lot of issues in the way this evidence was presented. The prosecutors never called their own experts to testify on his disability. They only cross-examined the state's experts, and in fact were allowed to submit evidence from their experts that were never heard by the jury. In addition, the jury was instructed incorrectly in how to determine whether someone has an IDD. And now jurors from the 3rd trial are submitting affidavits to Ernest's current attorneys saying that if they had the clear-cut definition of what an IDD was, they would not have recommended Ernest for a death sentence. The jurors said that they thought that an IDD meant that Ernest was unaware that he had committed a crime. And that is not the case. It doesn't have to do whether or not Ernest knows that a crime was committed, had to do with his culpability in the crime. People that have intellectual disabilities are highly influenceable. And so the idea that something was premeditated in Ernest's case isn't possible for someone like Ernest to do. There's a lot of issues with Ernest's case. Ernest was not the only person who committed the crime. There were 2 other co-defendants that were not sentenced to death. Ernest was, the day of that the crime happened, Ernest was broken up with by his longtime girlfriend, who basically took care of him. Ernest has never cooked himself a meal. He's never done his own laundry. He's always been dependent on other people to do these things. So this breakup was very devastating to him. He was already struggling with alcoholism. And in that day, he had smoked crack cocaine, which he allegedly got from his girlfriend's kids. And they went and they committed this crime together. The kids are not, were not charged with first-degree murder, and they're not on death row, and I don't believe they were even sentenced to life without parole for this crime. So Ernest is the only one. So proving that he has an intellectual disability would show that he could not have been the mastermind and the culpable person that was in charge of this crime. But these aren't, you know, these things need to be heard by medical experts. Every other state that has an intellectual disability claim has made it apparent and made it, Tennessee just revised their law so that there's a pretrial exemption where the ID claim is heard by a judge before it even goes before the jury of lay people. In Missouri, the law states that the ID claim has to be agreed upon, the pretrial exemption has to be agreed upon by the prosecutor and the defense attorney. Well, when the defense attorney put the pretrial exemption before the judge in Ernest's case, the prosecutor objected and the judge sided with the prosecutor. That is why the ID claim has only ever gone to a jury and not to a judge who could also, you know, rely on medical experts and look at more of the medical issues around the ID claim. So that is a huge issue. In fact, that is the ask right now for the Missouri Supreme Court to call a special master who can rely on medical experts. And if this closes in the courts, then it's solely in the hands of Governor Parson, who can invoke the Board of Inquiry to rely on medical experts to make sure that we are not moving forward with an unconstitutional execution. In addition to the ID claim, Ernest had part of his brain removed in 2008 because of a tumor. And so his functioning level is beyond what it was when his IQ was measured before 2008. The removal of the brain tissue, they believe, could cause him to have seizures because of the dosage of pentobarbital that they used during the execution. Also, in addition, another act of cruel and unusual punishment for Mr. Johnson moving forward with lethal injection. He asked for an alternative method before the United States Supreme Court. He asked for gas, he asked for a firing squad. They turned it down, and that was the last time he got a stay. In 2015, he was ready to be executed. He got a stay. I believe it was Governor Nixon at the time, in order to litigate the alternative method, and the Supreme Court turned that down, and they moved quickly to get him a date for execution of October 5th. So there's a lot of unconstitutional issues with Mr. Johnson, but while the Supreme Court has heard the 8th Amendment issue regarding the traumatic brain injury, they have not heard it regarding the ID claim, and certainly not based on the newest medical evidence, which yesterday they filed for a rehearing because they've revised the DSM-5 definition of ID to further clarify what an adaptive deficit is. So Ernest's case should be judged based on the newest evidence that the medical experts and clinicians are putting forward. Not only do we know that race is a factor in determining whether someone is sentenced to life or death. Just in 2020, Death Penalty Information Center reviewed cases of intellectual disability and found that Black men are more with intellectual disabilities are more likely to be sentenced to death. And so that was pretty groundbreaking. There's an innocent man named Purvis Payne in Tennessee, and he also has an intellectual disability. In fact, while his stay of execution is in place, Tennessee changed the law so that Purvis Payne is able to get a rehearing based on the ID claim. That isn't something that we have been working on, changing the law on the ID issue in Missouri. We've been focused on the traumatic brain injury and the severe mental illness issues in Missouri. But now looking backwards, this is something that is going to be really important to clarify, that there is a pretrial exemption regardless of whether or not the prosecutor agrees to it or not. So this is a nationwide problem. And as you can kind of see from the map, you know, Missouri is in company with not very many actively executing states. And this year only Missouri and Texas, Oklahoma is trying to reinstate executions, but Missouri and Texas, as if we move forward on October 5th, will be the only two states that have executed this year. We also know, and based on Ernest's life history, that there is a historical linkage between racial terror lynchings and the death penalty. Ernest's family history kind of highlights some of these connections. What you see here is a map of lynchings by county in Missouri. And let's see, there we go. Sorry about that. I can make things bigger. We see that counties that historically had a high number of racial terror lynchings are historically problematic for mass incarceration and application of the death penalty today. So we know in Boone County, and this is according to Equal Justice Initiative, that they recorded 3 racial terror lynchings between 1877 and 1950. And so we see that people that are currently on Missouri's death row, we also can look at the Secretary of State's traffic stop report for driving while Black. And we see that historically problematic counties are still problematic counties today. Mississippi County is where Ernest went to school, where he was raised. His parents identified themselves in court records as sharecroppers. And if you look at both his paternal and maternal grandparents, they worked on big farms in Missouri that we can link to historically having owned enslaved people. So there are some other folks on the road that we have like documented through census that they were from enslaved families, but with Ernest, we can see more through the Reconstruction time and the counties that he grew up with and how he went to segregated schools in the 1960s, how things have been stacked against him throughout his life. Ernest was also born with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. His mother died of alcoholism. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a precursor for ID. We know and have been working with Ernest's family members. His brother was institutionalized for ID and passed away in a medical setting for that. We know Ernest's sister and some of his nieces and nephews, and we can definitely see that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder has been prominent throughout his family, as well as low IQ, sometimes at the ID level, sometimes at the just below normal functioning level. But instead of relying on family history, family medical history, they relied on corrections officers' observations that he's able to play basketball to determine that he doesn't have an intellectual disability. So our ask is for Missouri to look at the medical evidence and rely on clinicians around this case. As I mentioned, right now, there's a rehearing that has been opened in the Missouri Supreme Court. I believe that the state has to respond to that, and then the defense will be able to respond to that. And we believe that'll close on or around September 27th. We meet regularly twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week with his legal team. I have a meeting right after this with his legal team. They aren't going to stop. There are things to litigate. It will go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and we know they will be very, very busy up to the time of execution, which is 6 p.m. on October 5th. But in the meantime, we've really pointed our asks and our activities for our constituents to reaching out to the governor to ask for the Board of Inquiry and to review the medical evidence in his case. We made the homepage of our website, Clemency for Ernest Johnson. So you can find that at madpmo.org. Or if you are on social media, we have an organizer named Lauren Subchuck, who is amazing. Our social media is up to date, and I just get compliments on it nationally. I don't personally manage it, but I'm very proud of our social media work. And then you can always reach out to us at info@madp.org, and we can get back to you quickly with any information that you might need. Let me just tell you also that on September 29th, There will be a petition drop. We have almost 30,000 signatures on a change.org petition. We will be bringing to Governor Parson. There will be an event in Boone County at the courthouse at 9 a.m. MADP's chapter in Boone County, as well as the Mid-Missouri Fellowship of Reconciliation, will have a caravan for clemency. They'll have a few speakers, brief remarks at the courthouse, and then they'll head up to the rotunda for the event and the petition drop on the 29th. As well as the execution, should it move forward, there will be a vigil and watch from 5 to 6 p.m. at the Boone County Courthouse on October 5th. And then the day of at noon, outside the governor's office, the Missouri Catholic Conference holds vigil outside on the second floor of the governor's office. So there will be some activities, events you can participate in. We have a toolkit on our website with the script for calling the governor, for emailing the governor, for writing the governor, for reaching out. We're also trying to nudge the media to get some more media attention to this. So we always appreciate letters to the editor. There's also a script in the toolkit on our social media as well, as how you can reach out to people to bring awareness. So that's really what the state office has been focused on really since January, when the Supreme Court was making comments on Ernest Johnson's case. We've been all hands on deck. But we know that we need to abolish the death penalty. We want to fight. We fight individual executions based on the lead of the legal teams, like the issues of the ID claim, but we have to abolish the death penalty for once and for all. That means no new cases. That means no moratorium. Biden has a moratorium on executions. He's not going to execute anyone, but we have 8 pending federal cases in Missouri. So what we saw last year was Obama had a moratorium and we were so grateful, but new people were getting put on federal death row. And then Trump came in and executed 13 individuals, 3 of which were from Missouri. So a moratorium is great and we appreciate that. It gives us pause where we don't have to fight executions, but we have to abolish it fully and for once and for all. It's not a tool in the toolkit that prosecutors need to use to get plea deals for life without parole. It is costly. Death penalty costs in the upwards of tens of millions of dollars more. I'm thinking about Ernest's case with 2 overturned sentences, the need for the medical experts, the mitigation team that went behind it for the defense. Our public defenders are so very underfunded. Removing death as an option in Missouri could preserve the integrity of our justice system in so many ways. So I know that y'all are Democrats, so you're aware. I don't need to tell you probably all the reasons why. If you can't think of them, you're welcome to go to our website. And other ways you can be involved in MADP, as I mentioned, go to our website, sign up for our email list. We appreciate the Muleskinners for inviting me today, and any other organizations that you can invite us to come speak with would be very well appreciated as well. We can take affiliate organizations to MADP, and we'd just love to have your involvement and your activity around the clemency case of Ernest Johnson. So with that, I think that is a lot of information that I gave you, and I'm very willing to turn it over to questions at this point.
And please, if you have questions, please go to the bottom of the screen, reactions, and there's an electronic raise your hand. That would be much easier to field some of these questions. So by all means. Try and get this in order. I probably won't get it accomplished in order. Pam, I see your hand raised.
I want to thank you for your presentation, but there's another case that I'm very concerned about. And I don't remember the gentleman's name, but the prosecutors are saying that he's not guilty. The people who testified against him have recanted, and our attorney general won't allow it to.
Yeah. In Missouri, innocence isn't enough. It's just, you're probably talking about Kevin Strickland or Lamar
Yeah,
Johnson. Those
it's-
are the two in the news right now, because I mentioned that Senate Bill 53 will now allow for prosecutors to do conviction review and look backwards. And Jean Peter Bakers in Kansas City has filed that for Kevin Strickland. Initially, they were trying to put him on death row, but they just gave him life without parole. But he is very likely innocent. I believe he's innocent. I'm not the judge who gets to determine that. And so I just saw in the paper this morning that the first week in October, they're going to have the hearing for Kevin Strickland.
Oh, that's
Kim
good.
Gardner has not filed for Lamar Johnson yet. Personally, I think she's waiting to see what happens in Kansas City first, because the Attorney General contends that, you know, it's their right and that Kevin Strickland is guilty, but now it's actually between the prosecutor and a judge and not the Attorney General. And so we're all watching that. That will be a great avenue for Marcellus Williams and the other innocent people on the row. So thank you for pointing that out, Pam.
That's good to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
Herb. You're on mute, I believe.
Your presentation said that 90 men had been executed since 1989. When was the last time a woman was executed in Missouri?
We have not had a woman executed in Missouri
Ever?
ever. And I believe we haven't had a woman sentenced to death in Missouri either. We've had pending cases. There was one recently, but it got taken down to second-degree murder in a plea deal. The woman from Missouri the woman that was executed federally, Lisa Montgomery, she was from Missouri, but that was not a state case. It was a federal case. So statewide, no women. It's a good question.
Yeah. Go ahead. Herb, if you,
One thing I did not hear you talk about regarding the death penalty is it's an horrendously expensive process.
She did.
She did.
Just very briefly, because that's a whole nother hour long presentation, but we know that argument resonates in the State House. We know that that argument should be important to conservatives who believe in less government. We have been meeting, and this is a behind the scenes thing, so you know, not everyone in the world needs to know this, but I'll share with you. We have been meeting with the budget committee members who are starting to want to get fiscal notes, because what happens is small counties that cannot afford the death sentence will transfer their cases to larger county. That happens to Boone. It happens in Cole County quite a bit. And then those larger counties have to incur the costs of sequestering those juries, et cetera, et cetera. And so instead of saying, oh, we need to create a fund so small counties can use the death penalty, we need to figure out what the death penalty is costing and if it is an effective public safety program. And if those dollars are better used to keep our community safe in other ways, like victim services, those are very real discussions that MADP has been having behind the scenes, especially with influential members of the budget committee. So thank you for bringing that up. That is a whole different presentation, but that is definitely a point that sticks in Missouri.
all right, thanks. If you've raised your hand electronically, please remove the raised hand signal so I can move on to other. Kathy Jensen's next. Kathy, you have a question?
Yes. My question is, do you have any suggestions about what might be a particularly effective way in terms of what is said to communicate with the governor? Is there anything that he has that he's hedging on at all regarding the death penalty?
That's a great question, and I wish I had an answer to that. We don't know. You know, he is pro-life and he is a religious person, but like there's a difference, you know. We haven't come up with the formula of what to say to him yet. There's actually a national organization called Evangelicals for Abolition that we are going to start to get some messaging and try out directly with the governor. it's very unfortunate because Eric Schmidt, our AG, as well as Governor Parsons, have family members with intellectual disabilities. They utilize services from the very same organizations that are writing him and asking him not to execute Ernest Johnson. So we've been like employing those stakeholders to have behind the scenes private conversations with him about the intellectual disability piece. But because he went forward with Walter Barton, and in fact, there seemed to be some kind of accolades given to Missouri amongst Trump supporters that we were the first state to move forward with execution during a pandemic, that we really don't know what messaging resonates. So we just have a small script that just sticks to the facts when we're reaching out to the governor right now. If you get any further insight on that, please reach out though and let us know.
All right, Al Plummer and then David Luthold, please.
Yes, I'm sorry, Carl. I'm technologically challenged. I haven't been able to find the electronic raise your hand button on my machine. Elyse, first, I would like to commend you for your tenacity in dealing with what I find to be another one of society's very frustrating conversations. Frustrating from the standpoint that I think you're absolutely correct. Murder, to punish somebody for murder is an insane idea. But I'm curious because it was brought up in an earlier question, when you confront folks who claim to be pro-life in one instance, and on the other hand, in a very similar scenario, they're all for putting somebody to death. How do they explain that away? I don't understand how that equation comes to a logical conclusion. It doesn't make sense to me. What do they say to you?
They tell me that they are pro innocent life. And so that's what they,
Okay.
that's like, I don't know, I wish I had a better answer. I've heard that so many times. Well, we're pro innocent life. So, I mean, I guess they need to like rephrase their slogan because yes, it is hard to understand. And I will say, like, Catholics are huge supporters. They understand the seamless garment, you know, that life is valuable, and we are doing life affirming work throughout. We can't do anything to bring back the victims of these very terrible crimes, but Ernest Johnson is alive today. And that's what I tell them is he's alive, he's living. This is a life that we can still preserve. And you know, when the death penalty was devised, we didn't have the same kind of prisons that we did, where people can live out their lives without parole and not be a future danger to society. And in fact, I will point out in Missouri, our death row, we don't really have a death row because our death sentence population is integrated in with general population, further disproving that they are a future dangerousness. Ernest Johnson has had no violent infractions since he was incarcerated. He had no violent crimes. They were all crimes of poverty, like theft and so forth, leading up to this one night in 1994. I talked to Ernest and I'm friends, you know, familiar with his spiritual advisor. He is very kind and caring and simple person. He loves ice cream. He's like talking to my children when they were in 3rd grade. We talk about, what did you eat? Did you get ice today? How did you make that pizza? Those kinds of conversations. And this has really shook the foundation of the 19 other people that are sentenced to die, because they very so much feel like if we can do this to Ernest, then we're going to do this to anyone. And so it's really that community of people inside and outside that are just trying to uplift Ernest every day, letting him know how very loved he is, even outside of his circumstances. But probably diverged from your question, but it has been just trying to put humanity, and these aren't salacious killers that the newspaper wrote about in 95. This is 27 years later, he's been institutionalized and he's thriving in there. A lot of the other people on the road never got medical attention. One guy was an active schizophrenia at the time of this crime and finally got the medicine he needed for the first time when he turned 21 and became incarcerated. 30 years later, you are not murdering these murderers. These are different people. And so the humanity piece and trying to put that back in there, we have been inviting our representatives. Kimberly Ann Collins out of St. Louis met one-on-one with Ernest. When Virginia abolished, senators, the governor, they've all been to the death chamber. They should have to confront the things that they're doing, that they're doing behind closed doors. They're doing these things in darkness. And so part of our work is to shed light on it and have people see what's going on. So sorry, diverged a little bit.
No,
from your
no,
question.
you did not diverge. Actually, you solidified my concept in terms of showing that there's a real person behind each of these pictures. And I once said, when people and humans tend to be real creative in their rationale for doing things, when folks say, well, I'm seeking justice, what they're really saying is, I want vengeance. And there are two different things there, but I'll shut up. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks, Dale and Elyse. Not just a commentary here, not to take on the issue of criminal innocence, but fetal innocence is something that I don't quite understand, actually. But nonetheless, let's
Thank you.
move on to Professor Luthon. You have a question?
My question is, have we had any governors in Missouri who have exonerated particular prisoners or assisted? What has been the record of the governors? My impression is that all governors have been sort of very supportive of the death penalty and have not helped out at all, but are there exceptions?
Not to my knowledge. I think as far as like the ones from 1989 on, where the modern era has happened, we haven't had any governor intervention. It's all been court and judges that have exonerated folks. They might be more sympathetic to some issues than others. Governor Greitens, as short as his stay as governor was, he was really influenced by social media. And so the campaign around Marcellus Williams, like once we got friends of Kim Kardashian involved and were able to get that, uproar around his case, he really looked at it. His legal team looked at the factual issues and he said, well, we really don't want to murder an innocent person. So I do know that the Governor's Council, Parsons Council, does have a meeting with the habeas attorneys, but there hasn't been a champion for that. And that's what is happening in states that abolish. It does take a champion, a governor who will champion. It doesn't have to be a Democrat either. In Illinois, it was a Republican governor who abolished.
Thank you. Kathy, you have a question?
Yes, I believe you said the Catholic Church is the only religious organization that's formally been involved against the death penalty in Missouri. Is that correct?
No, I just said they were huge supporters because of their pro-life, but we definitely get, support. We have some Jewish congregations that support us. Unitarians in Columbia have been excellent. We get support from many, many different types of denominations and congregations across Missouri. But as far as the pro-life argument, I would say the Catholics have nailed it with the seamless garment issue. But we don't just work with them on anti-death penalty stuff.
Okay, and as a follow-up then, do you know what Governor Parsons' religious affiliation is?
Yes, we do. He is Baptist. We've identified the congregation in his congregation in Bolivar, as well as where he attends church in Jefferson City. And so certainly, you know, we have conversations with people that are around him and his faith, but I don't believe we're like going to get a presentation to be able to do a presentation at his church or anything, but we do pay attention to that and who has his ear. And there is a Baptist lobbyist named Brian Kaler, who is very supportive of justice, but unfortunately nothing has seemed to work thus far. So we do power map them based on their religious affiliation as well. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
If there's one other quick question we can take, we've got a couple 3 minutes left. So if there's a question out there. Anyone? David?
Well, I just put in the chat, you know, I remember being horrified that Timothy McVeigh was quickly executed when we didn't even know what had actually happened. Is that part of the analysis too, that sometimes people are executed when the facts and the situations of the crime are not even clearly known? I know it used to be. Are you satisfied that it's, well, I guess you're not satisfied that it's not, that it doesn't still happen.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a pretty rigorous appeals process, but there are volunteers. In Missouri right now on the road, we don't have, well, I won't say that. We might have a volunteer who would prefer that we don't stop his execution. We actually just worked on a pending case in Joplin as a Native American man facing the death penalty. He was a volunteer. He asked his attorneys not to fight it. He doesn't want to plea. He would rather just be executed than have to spend, he's from Oklahoma. There are no Native American spiritual advisors in Potosi. And so he wanted to just be executed. He was like, make this quick. I don't want to do life without parole in Missouri DOC. MADP, we reached out to his legal team and were actually able to connect him to a spiritual advisor from the Cherokee Nation. And he ended up accepting his plea deal and he goes to trial next week. And so those types of things where people don't even see the humanity in themselves and they become a volunteer, it just further, you're right, David, it further proves the argument that it's arbitrarily applied. You could have a mastermind terrorist who volunteers and then they move quickly without figuring out the parts of the case that they need to figure out. It isn't fair, and the federal government has different rules than the state would have as far as that goes. So we don't, right now we're kind of in a good place, but yeah, there's the arbitrariness is just further exemplified and how they let McVeigh do that.
But certainly McVeigh was a federal case. He was executed in Indiana where they do that, but I did not understand that he was a volunteer.
He waived all of his appeals. Yeah. I
see. So a volunteer can take all his secrets with him.
Apparently so, because the attorneys, even though they, you know, they're supposed to do what's in your best interest, they have to listen to you as a client. And if you say to waive your appeals, then that's what the attorneys have to do.
Ugh, that's not justice.
It's, yeah.
Well, let's end with that.
That's not justice.
Thank you, Elyse. It was a terrific presentation, obviously on a vital topic and cause. So thank you for being here, and thank you for all the folks that were listening and offered questions as well. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. I'm not sure who's next. Next week, does someone know who's on the agenda for next week?
Scott Hollis.
Okay.
Isn't it Scott Hollis?
Wait,
And the
what's the date? Is it the 24th?
No.
Right?
Yes, it's the 20.
Right.
24th, yeah.
I actually asked Scott Clardy to give an update
Clardy.
on COVID and the health department and their vaccine program. So he's going to be here.
Oh, okay.